recording. We have a number of folks who can't make it. Ned can be with us for a short time. I think Fred said he could be with us for a short time. Um,
I have to be off at about 2:15
okay.
my
Uh,
time.
and I'm going to probably around 11:30, well, 10:30, no, probably around 11. I need to absent myself for a while. I'll be back, but Karen is at an appointment and I'll need to go and pick her up. Uh, might sound like a doctor's appointment, but it's actually a nail appointment. So,
I'm gonna be gone for just
okay. So it looks like we're going to have a fair amount of off and ons uh, today, and I don't know, conversation might get to be absolutely fantastic, or it might drag on, so we might want to say forget about it. But but for the moment, we are all here. Anything exciting happening?
Anything exciting? What's exciting?
Exciting.
I love John Allen and the crux reports that he gives from the Vatican. And he's very high, I think, in praise of the next plan for Pope Francis, which is less travel, but more focused. And I think he's really gutsy to think he can touch the Ukraine and Moscow conflict. I don't know if others of you have any hopes of that, but I admire him big time. That's why I put St. Francis over my shoulder here.
Ah,
He's a
yeah.
reminder for me of a great vocation.
In my opinion, the political stuff simply is not working, and Russia and Ukraine are and profess to be deeply religious countries, even though there's that Christian nationalism seeping in and controlling. But, probably if anybody has a chance to bring some kind of sense to this, it probably is Pope Francis.
I plan to pray for him big time
We
every
need to
day
pray big
in that
time, that's for
regard.
sure.
Yeah.
they've announced the trip that he's going to Kazakhstan, where he's going to meet with Kirill,
Right.
who's the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, and is generally thought to be, if not a KGB agent, at least very much in Putin's pocket.
Very much, yeah.
The Vatican is always slow to get in between, because this is an interesting conflict for them. They're a sovereign state, to get in between two states in terms of when they're at war. Because they see, well, we love the Russian people and we love the Ukrainian people. And Pope Francis has made a few of that kind of little hints that, that NATO kind of pushed, the story that's going around with some folks that NATO pushed Putin too far. And they should have been a little more gentle, I think, in terms of, that's the story. I don't really know the plus of, enough about foreign policy in that part of the world to say whether they're right or wrong. But he has said that if he's going to meet Kirill, and I think then that will open up the possibility of him going to Ukraine. But the Catholic Church has always had a different view on war than the United States, for example. Pope Paul VI sent a legate to Washington to implore George W. Bush not to invade Iraq because it was a preemptive war. I never heard of that happening before in
Yeah.
my lifetime or in American history, actually.
And George Bush sent a delegation of people like, who was it, Michael Novak and a few
Yeah.
other prominent Catholics to try to convince Pope John Paul II otherwise.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and then they, according to this new book out that Bob mentioned, Discordant Catholics, they turned around and misinterpreted his appreciation of American capitalism or lack thereof in Centesimus Annus. But at any rate, talk about doing favors.
Yeah.
And so it seems to me that if he in fact goes to Kazakhstan and meets with Kirill, it opens the door for him to go to Ukraine. But the United States is also being somewhat criticized internally for laying off the diplomatic solution because we want to humiliate Russia.
Hmm.
And as you can see, this is a real, it's walking on eggs kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's the position he's kind of in.
Right, walking on eggs. Actually, he's having a little trouble walking these days.
Let alone on.
Yeah.
And and so and I don't mean to be facetious.
Eggs or no eggs.
Yeah, about that. I think that has the potential. The fact that he's mostly wheelchair bound whenever he has to, stand. He has to sit and kind of be in a wheelchair and move about. I think that's going to curtail his activities greatly in the months and, please God, years ahead. But I'm not very optimistic that it's going to be years, given what his health situation is. And speaking of Francis, though, one of the brethren here sent out the link to his homily at the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Quebec, literally, I think last Thursday while he was still there. And I don't know if you had a chance to read it. It caught my attention because I had seen it excerpted in the NCR online. So I read the whole homily, and it is a gem. It is brief, as Francis says homilies should be, 8 to 10 minutes, although he's been known to exceed that. But it's really lovely. And what caught my attention was a reference to he quoted in the homily the words of a Canadian by the name of Lonergan. And so just that reference might catch some people's attention. And so I thought that was intriguing, that whole quote from Lonergan.
Where's Fred? We need Fred.
Bob, what did you take away from it in terms
Of the
what struck you about the homily? What?
Yeah, it was Francis. It was Francis all the way. In terms of, let me just recollect for a moment there.
Yeah. Who was that the talk that he gave to the priests and bishops in Quebec?
Exactly. It was the talk to the priests and the bishops and the deacons and anyone involved in ministry, and it had to do with secularization.
Yeah.
And
the difference between secularism and secularization.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that the whole notion of love and caring and responsibility is at the heart of everything that we did. I wish I had taken more notes.
Yeah. No.
But I said with such a bright group,
Yeah.
and someone had sent out the link, and I
Yeah.
apologize for not remembering who it was. You can go back and take a quick
Okay.
peek at it because it's a very easy read.
Yeah.
Yeah, another thing that impressed me a great deal was, and I really enjoy reading the transcripts of his visits with the Jesuits in every country
Hmm.
that he goes to. You know, you get a real slice of his informal mind among colleagues. I mean, we get a slice of his informal mind among reporters, that's one thing. You get a good slice, I think, among colleagues from those. And you know, I don't remember anything in particular in this, but they asked him some rather, pointed questions, and he gave good answers. If I knew I was going to talk about it, I would have read it again. But um,
Yeah.
Welcome to the club there.
yeah, the other thing that impressed me is, did anybody
What I have for
has
dinner last
anybody
night.
ever heard of that Inuit town that he went to way up north of the Arctic Circle? It's bordering the north side of Hudson Bay. I looked it up on the on Google Maps, and it's a very, very small village with an airport that they built as an international airport, and an interesting, almost brand new Anglican cathedral, which features on the Google Maps. But it's just a rather tiny sort of settlement. Very interesting for him to, go there before returning to Rome, and kind of going on what is clearly native turf.
Does anyone know why that particular village? I don't, I knew that he had gone to this unpronounceable
Mhm.
village up in the far north, but I didn't see anywhere reasons, why that particular spot. There must be some connection with,
Nearby, there are a lot of, I guess we would call them here reservations, reserved lands for the Inuit and other um, native peoples up there. The other thing that I did notice, the airport seems to be fairly well developed. In fact, they even call it the such and so international airport, although I doubt that there's regular commercial flights going in and out of there. But there may be. I didn't really
that's a,
look.
that's a good point, Tom. So safety and security
There may,
probably
yeah,
entered into the
right.
selection process.
And perhaps the fact that it's on the eastern, towards the east part of Canada rather than going further west, um, may have entered in too.
Oh, yeah, I think also, what strikes me about it is, I read a little bit about that. It is very remote. I said before, I think he's the master of the pastoral gesture. And so, he's not going to go to a country to do that and spend his time in Toronto or Ottawa. Regardless of what the political or communicative value is of going to a place like that, he's going to be driven first by the pastoral value of going to it.
Yeah.
It's like naming the Archbishop of Mongolia a cardinal when there are 30,000 Catholics in the country. So it's a very interesting pattern of thought for someone at his level.
Yeah. What, 30,000 Catholics among about 3 million people.
Right.
I was amazed at how absolutely sparse that huge area of Mongolia
Right.
has remained.
Right.
And of course, they were the conquerors of the world at one time.
Yep.
Well, you could go see the tomb of Genghis Khan,
Yeah.
which is quite a structure. One of my partners actually did that.
And it's nestled in between China and Russia, but I gather very fiercely independent.
I don't know.
My only source is a Wikipedia article I read about 2 weeks ago.
I sent a link to everybody of his homily up in Canada.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Right, thank you. You know, I had a little follow-up question about Fuchs and Herring. They have this basic theory about the fundamental option for God. And that is kind of what drives your attitude. So it kind of takes the notion of individual, kind of the collection of individual sin out of the picture. And so this week I was kind of thinking about that a little bit, and I said, so what kind of action, of series of actions, or patterns of sinful actions would break one's fundamental option for God?
Mhm.
You know, I think I would phrase that question a little differently,
Yep.
and maybe, what breaks your fundamental option for God is your attitude from which the actions come. So that it may not be and actually Jesus speaks very much about this in his Sermon on the Mount. You know, it's not so much the individual actions that are sinful, that destroy our relationship with God. It's what is behind them. The source. You know, am I striving to be God-centered even if I'm doing things that I realize are incompatible with that, and that I realize, disrupt, if not break, the relationship that I still
Yeah,
really want.
Yeah.
Versus I'm doing all the right things because I just think I am so perfect, and God is going to reward me for doing all the right stuff. Well, to my mind, that's a fundamentally sinful attitude.
Mhm.
You're triggering for me a thought that I've had from time to time. I remember the source was a very old, even ancient professor at Assumption College. I graduated from there in 1963. And at that time, he was he was retired, he was 70 or 80, but he was a very wise man. And my roommate at the time remembers his dad many years earlier being at the same college and having this professor in moral theology. And the professor basically, when this question was raised, what could possibly, in today's language, sever the golden cord, sever that cord? And he basically smiled and looked around the class and he said, nobody in here has to worry. You have to be very intelligent to commit that kind of sin. I never forgot that, because
Yep.
there's something
Hold on a
to
second.
it.
Hold on a second.
He can hear
Come,
us.
Bob.
Bob, you can go. He can hear us.
Oh, okay. Hi, Natividad. Welcome. Looks like you're flying in. He's in his auto, I take it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. My roommate's dad was no slouch, a Harvard Law School graduate. He was.
May I interrupt? I need to be gone for about 20 minutes.
You're gonna miss the best part. No.
Yeah. So
We'll
I
try to behave.
try to behave,
Or have fun.
and well, you all try to behave too. Um,
Good luck with that.
a difficulty is I'm the one that has to. Let's see if I can get rid of the waiting room here, and
Oh, so if someone wants to get in.
Yeah.
Just don't sever the golden cord, Tom.
I'll try not to sever the golden cord.
That's good, Phil.
Um, but go ahead, keep
Go ahead, Bob.
going, and I'm going to just play around with this a little bit.
Yeah, it was, I was visiting with my roommate at his home. I used to go up for a weekend every now and then in Manchester, New Hampshire. His dad at the time was an attorney, no slouch, very incredibly bright fellow, and really
Well, I would hope so.
a polymath in the best sense of the word. I mean, multiple languages and French Canadian roots, Harvard Law School grad. He was the Attorney General in New Hampshire for a number of terms, but he loved philosophy and theology. That was his, and so this was a significant question for him. And he had just this grin on his face as he basically said, "Fala polio get the assumption." He used to say in class, and he'd repeat it every now and then. Don't be alarmed. The chances of your being able to, in terms of intelligence, severing your relationship with God, it's extremely, today we'd say slim. He used other words. And I never forgot that. And so the more I think about that, if this God who loves us beyond our understanding, he loves us in a way that we really cannot comprehend. And not only me, us, you, but all of his creation. What would it take to sever that? So it just becomes such an intriguing question. What would it really take? With hints from people like this professor, don't worry, relax. Yes. Tongue in cheek, you're not smart enough to be able to commit a serious enough offense to break the relationship.
Yeah. I have to weaken the relationship right now because I do have to go. I found out a way to disable the waiting room. So anybody who comes in can just join.
Welcome, Gary Lombardi.
Welcome to Gary.
Yeah.
And I'll be
Hi,
back.
Gary.
Hi, Gary.
I'll be back in about 20 minutes or so.
Okay.
Okay,
Gary,
so Bob, what you're talking about is you got to work at it to go to hell.
Hell, what is that, by the way? I mean, what?
Well, I think it's inchoate enough that the church goes to great lengths to tell us who's in heaven, but they never spend any effort to tell us who's in hell.
Just a few medieval
Well,
artists.
arguably Judas would be an exception to that.
Well, no, I don't arguably.
Yeah.
Arguably.
I mean, when Jesus says, better for that man had he not been born.
Yeah, but that could be what happened to him personally and internally.
Yeah, who knows?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
Bob, before you got here, we spent some time on Origen's theory that hell is not permanent. I mean, whoever may be in hell gets a second shot. And Origen, I guess, came up with that. Or was it Irenaeus? No, it was Origen. And then John Paul, not John the 23rd, John Paul came up with this, said, this is something for which we all should pray, that nobody goes to hell permanently or loses their salvation permanently. And Father Newhouse was on that bandwagon, of all people. And somebody else.
Baron.
Oh, Hans Urs von Balthasar.
Yeah, but Baron gets his
And Barron.
Because Barron basically says, yeah, there's a hell, but we don't know if there's anyone in it.
What
Yeah,
about Satan?
yeah, I think he was quoting at that point Teresa of Avila.
Well, it could have been influenced by von Balthasar as well.
Sure, it's because someone pointedly asked her in some conversation, and she said, "Yeah, there, the church teaches that there's hell. I just don't believe there's anybody there."
And Teresa said that?
If I remember correctly, and sometimes my quotes are off, but I'm pretty sure it was Teresa. It was either Teresa of Avila or Teresa of the Child Jesus. I think it was Avila. I just, of course I believe in it, of course, but I just don't believe there's anybody there.
But then what's the point of having it?
I
Well,
think that's the question.
I think, it's like, it reminds me of the story about the farmer in County Kerry in Ireland who was asked by the police. The IRA was landing small planes on the beaches of Western Ireland, delivering guns. And so there was a farmer who had a farm on a bluff overlooking a beach. And the national police, the Gardaí, came to visit him one day and said to him, have you seen any small airplanes landing on the beach? And in typical fashion of a Kerry man, probably a Catholic who has learned about both and, he said, he said, yes, I did and I didn't. He said to the police, I did and I didn't. And it seems to me that's a pretty good statement of the church's theory on hell.
Well, but we got to remember what John Paul said is, I think, we dare to pray that nobody is in hell personally.
Right.
In other words, it seems like the presumption is to the contrary, that
Right.
hell counts.
Well, but hell, more and more, I think with, our theology of encounter and that kind of thing, the philosophy of encounter is telling us that, while hell is an enduring image in terms of being a place, that the real thing is, in fact, your relationship with God.
Yeah.
And the question is, what would it take to kind of break that to the point where it couldn't be repaired, or is that possible?
What about that? There's that odd phrase in Paul's letter to Timothy, where he says that if we deny him, he will deny us. But then he goes right back to say, but he will never. How does it, Frank? You know that.
Yeah, he will never go back. He will never abandon those he loves. Something like that.
It's in morning prayer, in one of those little scripture things in morning prayer, and it's from, I think it's 2 Timothy. I had to look it up. I looked it up one time because it's so contrary to everything else about God's unconditional love. But it says, if we remain faithful, he remains faithful. If we deny him, he will deny us. But he will never turn his back. I forget exactly what it says.
You're right. It's almost the exact words, Gary. I forget too, but.
And I don't know exactly, but that one little phrase, how that all works out. I looked it up one time, and I think I went to just under the internet. I probably got a couple of Protestant scripture scholar explanations, but I've never heard a Roman Catholic explanation. Or at least maybe I have. I could look it up. I still have my Jerome biblical commentary. I could look it up. But.
Yeah, I have that in the Paulus commentary. It would be interesting to look it up, I think.
One argument. I'm all for hell being blown up by Green Beret at the end of time or something, and nobody's there. But one to me, a very powerful argument for people actually going to hell, except for me, of course, but other people,
Yeah.
has been that human beings have the stature and heft to really fuck it up and blow it eternally and cosmically. Maybe we really are beings of such grandeur, you know, that we can make really damning moral choices.
You know what, George? I think I'd come at it a little differently.
Good.
Uh,
'Cause I don't want
And
to.
the way I would come at it is one of the images I have of God, which lasts for me, for better, for worse. I like to think it's better. Really comes from the Eastern traditions of the laughing Buddhas, and I have one on my little shrine to remind me this is probably how God is, much more than anything else, so different from us. God spends most of his time giggling at us. And there isn't much that we can do that he doesn't keep on giggling. Sometimes full blown. Have you seen images of these laughing Buddhas?
Yeah.
They're mostly naked except for the loincloth, but they're just layers and rolls of adipose tissue, fat, and the image of God. All of that rolling is sort of one of my images of him. And there isn't anything anybody can do. Because this God is just such a tremendous lover of all his creation, and that's the image that's my image that comes to mind. Good luck finding it, you know, even though I every now and then something happens and I go, well, if there's a hell, that person's in it without, or will be without a doubt. That's absolutely evil. But that's Bob. That's not me.
Well,
Yeah, that's my
I think the Catholic Church does toy with universalism. I don't think it embraces it, but I think it toys with it.
At least, yeah.
in the way that our
Well, for instance, for example, in the formula for consecration, the debate that went on between for all and for many. You know, the sacrifice of Christ was given for all until Benedict XIII, the 16th, thought that it was more correct to say that it was for many. And of course, there's certain Hebrew translations of the word that say for many means for all. So you have this kind of debate that goes on. And there are other places in the scriptures, for example, where if you read them just quickly, you would say, well, you know, salvation's for all. I mean, it's offered, it's offered to everybody, but and therefore it's possible for everyone to achieve it. And in fact, everyone may well achieve it.
You know, that Second Vatican Council document on the church is that whole thing about, you know, the various layers of incorporation, levels of incorporation into the church.
Right.
I mean, it's like, even it's at the very end, even those who somehow have some slight sense of something or other, you know, that's the feeling that's a sense that you get, you know, are to that degree, you know, offered, or however you want to, I forget how they call it now, but incorporated into God's plan of salvation. And that's
Remember the novel Sophie's Choice?
Yeah, the movie. Yeah,
In the
No,
movie?
I never read it or saw the movie.
Oh, well,
Meryl Streep was within it, though, wasn't she?
yeah, she was.
As, and almost everything else too. That she I'm sure she was terrific.
Oh, she was. Well, I mean, it's Sophie has two children, and a guard at Auschwitz makes her choose which one will be permitted to live. That's evil, you know, that's pretty bad. You know, Schindler's List. I mean, I could see, I could shadow that the Holocaust is my obsession, but it's hard, absent some profound conversion or something, to see those Nazis waltzing into heaven. I mean, I hope they do. I mean, I'm rooting for them, but it's just, there's so much, you know, they were such profoundly evil people.
You know, does that mean? I mean, I like in in John's gospel, it's most clear that judgment is not what God does. You know, it's what we do. You know, I mean, you know, even in the prologue, you know, this is the light came into the world, but people, you know, chose darkness rather than light. And it's very clear in John that that's so that maybe people close in on themselves and are incapable of opening up to the gift. And in that sense, I get that I don't know what happens when they die.
Well, who knows? I mean, maybe that doesn't refute universalism at all, you know?
Well, I mean, it seems to me that too, we have to be careful of focusing on the extremes to make the point, you know, like the rape of a 10-year-old to make the whole point for all abortions.
Yeah, as I tell George Farag.
Yeah, or the Nazis to make the whole point for every evil in the world. I guess mine is more a pastoral question, is to say, you know, over hundreds of years, we have taught people that there's a cumulative aspect to sinful actions that you can't stop. In other words, once you go beyond this particular thing, you're done. Rather than whether or not you know, the attitude you have, even as you're battling those actions, even as you do them and you're battling them, that's what will save you, not condemn you. I mean, make it sense. I'm taking more a pastoral approach to, you know, to our people who aren't, you know, extreme Nazis or people, things like that. The ordinary Christian who in his life, all of us sin. So is there a point in time where the cumulative aspect of individual sins gets to the point where you say, well, eat, drink, and be merry, to hell with it, I'm done anyway?
I didn't know that was part of our shtick.
Maybe it's not.
What do you mean, George?
Frank, I
Well-
still see God giggling.
Maybe
I still see God giggling and using human imagery, God giggling and saying, nice try.
Yeah, what do we say? QED, Bob, or something?
Yeah.
Does anybody remember the movie La Dolce Vita?
A long time ago.
Yeah, I do.
Fellini.
One of the most I don't know why indelible images to me was at the end of the movie when the former reporter and now completely immersed in all of the hedonism of the actors and authors that he's joined, is back out on the beach. Beginning of the movie, he's at the beach and he meets a little girl and they have a wonderful conversation, which to me was an indication of this man's goodness and his generosity and his innocence. And at the end of the movie, he stumbles out of a castle or a very large mansion where they've been having days of debauchery, and he stumbles out into the sand of the beach, and he meets the little girl again. And there's a little puddle, not so little but not big, of water, and they're both at either end of the puddle, and she's trying. She sees him and is so happy, and calls to him, and he can't hear her. He can't understand her, and she continues to invite him to take her hand, to join her, and he can't hear her. He sees her, but she's at the other end of this water, and he's now, I guess, my interpretation of this is that he's now accumulated so much self that he can't come out of it, and is lost. That's been, for whatever reason, just an abiding recollection in my mind. That's a long time ago. Has
Well,
anybody?
I remember that.
But I agree, Ned, I agree with that sense and with what Frank said, but it's just the opposite. I think the opposite is the struggle that people make. I recall a retreat that I was on, the priest who gave the retreat, he quoted Thomas Aquinas, and I'm not a scholar, so I don't look all these things up, but he said that Thomas Aquinas said a saint is a sinner who never stops struggling with their sin, and that is in line with that. I don't know, Bob, if you Charpentier or Bob Monod or Frank, you go with Fuchs, who came up with the that idea of the fundamental option. I got a book years ago. I think I was still in the seminary at the time, and I think I still have it. I have to look. I threw all my books out, and sometimes I wish I hadn't thrown all of them out. But anyway, I got rid of most of them anyway, 25 boxes of books. It'll save my executor a lot of work. But it was a book called Sin, Liberty, and Law by a Belgian Jesuit, I think, named Louis Mondin. And that's where I first came across this idea of the fundamental option. That our life is generally moving in one particular direction, and though we fail and fall and all that sort of thing, but the fundamental direction is moving us towards God. That's the fundamental option, and you can't. It would be very, very rare to incorporate your whole entire direction and life in one single act. It seems to me.
I can't agree more with you. That sounds and the everything that we've read. I mean, you hear St. Paul saying, "I've got this thorn in the flesh."
Right.
And I don't know what to do with it. And I who's going to save me? How am I going to get over this? Well, thank God. I mean, thank the Lord Jesus. And then he goes on to something else. I'm thinking, wait a minute. Is this just an internal struggle that we go through until we meet face to face?
Well, but his thorn in the flesh could have been bad health, Ned. It wasn't necessarily.
Oh yeah, no.
It
could have been anything.
But he ends up saying,
but the way.
Well, he does say that things that I want to do, I don't do.
right. Yeah.
Exactly, and it's at the end of that.
But he ends up, Ned, saying, but it's in weakness that power reaches perfection. It's precisely in the weakness, and in being weak that you then encounter God. Richard Rohr, this morning's, I don't know if those of you who read Richard Rohr, but that's what he's saying in his commentary today. He's been talking about what did he call the church's cult of innocence? that, we've somehow or other been striving to be innocent. He says, that's a cult. It's only when you fall through the bottom of yourself that you finally reach the foundation of God. That's how Pope Francis identified himself the very first interview he had. I'm a sinner. So it's
go ahead. I'm sorry.
And he insisted, and I'm not just saying some holy thing because I'm Pope here about I'm a sinner. No. I mean it. Remember,
that's right. No, that's right. Yeah. It was Latin. We have a right to it.
It really does in my life seem that it's only when I am conscious of my decisions, which have, when made against God or against his law of love, that I feel deeply disconnected, and what brings me running back to her, and when I'm high on grace and Eucharist and community and all that kind of stuff, it's a lot harder for me to maintain some kind of staying the course. I fall off the wagon and feel it. And so my conclusion from universalize my experience, but it sounds consistent with, in weakness you'll be strong, because that's if we ever lose the sense of the loss of the relationship, or of the peril of the loss of the relationship with God, and then we struggle to get back, to pray, to meditate, to contemplate, to change our behaviors. If we lose the sense of the loss, I think we are lost, completely lost. Does that make sense?
Yeah. What were the two things that we learned when we were growing up? The sin of presumption and the sin of despair.
Yes.
That you presume, you say, well, God's going to forgive me anyway. I sort of felt that a few times. But the worst.
What are Saturday night confessions for?
That's what, George, you sound like George. Remember George Carlin? Remember George, comedian? And he did this big deal about confession. He said it's the wanna. You want to feel up, Ellen. You get up here. You make the. You get out. You go out. You give her a call, and he says you might as well forget it. You've already sinned when you did the wanna. But he says it's you go to confession on Saturday night, and then bam, you're back out on the streets on Monday morning.
He was I think he's the funniest guy I've ever heard.
I'm not sure his theology is compelling, but
no, his theology is crazy, but it's funny.
I think he was a renegade Catholic. I'm sure.
Yeah, he was. Yeah. There's a lot of them out there.
Yeah, loads of them.
Yeah.
Jackie Gleason. Yeah.
Jackie
Pence.
Gleason?
Yeah.
What, was he a renegade Catholic?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and he took stances that, and apparently he really knew his Catholic faith. He was kind of famous for that, and he would stand for it, but his behavior was not in keeping with it.
I don't ask me why, but I'm reading the biography of Bing Crosby. It's in 2 volumes. The guy is a music critic, and it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, Bing Crosby was the symbol of American Catholicism for decades. He really was, you know. He and Bishop Sheen, I guess. But and I've recently gone through this orgy of reading about JFK because I've been trying to just figure out, you know, was he merely a cultural Catholic? Did he have any real beliefs of a Catholic nature? And I concluded he did indeed. But plus a lot of cultural Catholicism. But both Bing Crosby's biographer, he says, you know, he had a real drinking problem when he first came to Providence, Bing did. And he said, no matter what, he always made Sunday Mass. Just in passing, hi, Tom. And the same is true of JFK. Apparently, he never missed going to Sunday Mass. He could be in some, you know, Nebraska quasi-village looking for delegates before 1960, and he would go to Mass and say his night prayers every night on his knees. Go figure, you know.
Well, his mother lived old enough that if he didn't do it, he'd have to answer to her.
Yeah.
But it is true, you know, that there's a pew in St. Francis Xavier Church in Hyannisport, Mass, that says this is where the President of the United States used to sit on Sundays when he came to Mass here. So it is broader than a simple immersion in a Catholic culture. But, you know, there were Irish rogues, basically. And so they...
Does anybody remember George Teddy Kennedy with all of the issues that he got into, Kopechne and all that kind of stuff, and screwing around, you know, sexually, and his visit with the Pope at some point when it was found that he had a brain disease and that it was heading him on the way to death. And he visited the Pope.
No, he wrote a letter, man.
A letter to the Pope?
Yeah, a very self-serving letter, might I add.
Well, if he published it, I suppose it would be self-serving. But the question was, I'm going to be okay, aren't I? I mean, I know I've had my problems or
look
issues,
at all the
but
good I tried to do. Yeah, that's the letter.
He hasn't lost it. He still wants to live the life of well, at least he wants to get into heaven. So that's it could be interpreted to be just simply cultural, or it could be interpreted to be a plea of forgiveness and assurance. And Jesus always said to the sinners, "Go and sin no more."
Well, his second wife was a serious Catholic. What's her name? Victoria?
Victoria, yeah. She was from a very deep-seated Louisiana Catholic family. Victoria Reggie is her name.
Yeah.
And her father was a judge and a leading Catholic layman in Louisiana.
The first time they met, he was invited to some party at her father's house. He's a prominent Democrat, et cetera, et cetera. And he comes knocking at the door, and she opens it and sees him by himself and says, "What happened? You couldn't get a date?" Now, how would you not fall in love with a woman like that? You know, she was Teddy Kennedy.
Well, I mean, I think the same thing comes, you know, my comment about them being basically Irish rogues. But Catholicism was, you know, very much in their bones. And, you know, I think something that people forget, because it's kind of put into the kind of political polarization that we have in the country today was that Ted Kennedy spent, whatever, the Kopechne thing, the whole Chappaquiddick bit, etc. He spent his entire political career trying to get health care for people who didn't have it.
Yeah.
A wealthy man born with a golden spoon in his mouth. But that was the signature of his entire, even to the point where he said that Nixon made him an offer in the 60s and 70s that he wanted the whole thing and it didn't have it. And so he refused it. And he said it was a mistake that haunted him ever afterwards, that, the enemy of the good is the perfect. And
Yeah.
so, and so, I think to some extent that was driven, it was driven by a complex. A Boston Irish Catholic, the Democratic Party and the Union movement, because that's where their power came from, and the Catholic Church. And there was a certain sense where those were factors always in their lives, even though not necessarily factors that we would always, as in anyone's life, say they did great things or they were saints.
Well,
I actually knew Ted Kennedy. Because I worked for Paul Tsongas, and I used to run into him quite a bit in Boston, and he was a very good man, basically. I mean, a flawed man like we all are, but not a bad person.
Well, good. That's my picture of it. But I read Jack Kennedy was a real buddy of William Manchester, who wrote, The Death of a President and Churchill, and, a lot of books. And he told him, Manchester used to come by the White House and have a drink with JFK quite often towards the end of the day. And, they'd both been in the Pacific and had been wounded, and, they had a lot in common. And Kennedy was talking about his faith in passing, and he said, well, I like it when I go to Sunday Mass and I come out with the kids and Jacqueline, and they're taking photographs of me, and I like that. But I don't like it when I come out of confession and they take photographs, because depends on the priest. But if I get one of these priests that says, "Oh, good evening, Mr. President, how are you?" And then I got to tell him all my sins and he knows who I am, that's humiliating, and I don't like it. And I started to say it fucks me up, but that's not what he said. But it's humiliating. And then to have some guy take a picture of me, when I'm walking out. So point being, he must have made real confessions.
Yep.
One would hope.
That's where I say, I think when I first read that about the fundamental option from in that book that I read by Louis Mondin, it just made so much sense, and it was very comforting, because when you're struggling to move in a particular direction, we're not going to go in a straight line ever, and it's just funny that we're having this conversation, and Richard Rohr talks all about that today in his reflection. It's interesting.
John,
I'm going to revisit that.
It's a pure coincidence, and God has nothing to do with it.
There are no coincidences.
So I read this book. Somebody recommended this.
Gary's World.
Yeah, somebody recommended a book to me, and I read it, called The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt. One of the longest novels I've ever read in my time. And my God, am I ever going to get done with it? It was very good. But she has one line in there saying that coincidences are God's way of being anonymous. It struck me.
I like that.
Very much. Yeah.
I like a statement. It's from Jung or from one of Jung's followers. There are no coincidences. And then goes on to explain the whole notion of synchronicity, which in terms of the language we're using here today, there is a greater design out there, that we're all connected with one another, that there are no accidents like coincidences. It's all part of a part of a grand design, a plan of Jung doesn't talk about necessarily a loving God in that particular incident, but I immediately jump to it and go, yeah, that's what it's all about. This is not a God who's a puppet master, sort of controlling things and eliminating free will, because after all is said and done, borrowing from Star Trek, that free will is ultimately the prime directive. You do not interfere. Even God won't interfere with his creation, because God loves her creation so much.
But isn't that another, we were talking, Tom, when you were gone, we were talking about hell, and maybe you were talking about it before I got on. I had trouble logging on today, but is that one of the reasons to say that the possibility of hell is really to accentuate the fact that we have free will?
Say more.
Well, I don't know any more than what I just said, that, that it's just that you have a possibility of, of salvation or damnation. And it's just God's, what do you think? A correlative of having free will, that you have a choice.
Well, one of the things that
I'll leave, guys. See you next week.
Have a good golf game. Are you going golfing?
No, I have 2 appointments I have to go to.
Okay.
Bye,
Okay.
bye, Bob B. Bye-bye.
Bob,
Always
care,
a joy. Bye, Bob.
Have a good day and week.
one of the things that the way that I tend to look at it is free will does mean the possibility that one can say no and not change your mind no matter what. And that hell would be basically something that you are creating by saying no to God. Now, the thing that I think I have to see as a correlative to that is you can never say no in a vacuum. There is no such thing as an absolute no. It all depends on what your yes is. So if I'm saying no to something, I'm saying yes to something else. And it seems to me that the ultimate determinant, and this I think goes into that fundamental option stuff, the ultimate determinant is what I am saying yes to is self rather than God, or inward self turned into myself in a way that I exclude the other. And thinking about that, I think that helps me at least to understand the possibility of a hell, because we created ourselves. It's not something that God tries his, pardon the expression, God tries his damnedest to keep us out of that self-centeredness that in itself is hell. But and I think Dante has sort of an image of that the Satan is the ultimate cold self-centeredness. And to me that helps me a lot to understand that. Just one other little interesting thing. Lately, if you've been keeping up with the science news, there's been a lot of talk about the discovery of black holes and the imaging of black holes. And it dawned on me that the black hole might be a good metaphor for understanding hell, because a black hole is basically a conglomeration of matter that is so dense that nothing, including light and radiation, is able to escape the pull of its own gravity. So, I think it's possible to say we, with our own free will, can create our own black hole that is so concentrated on self, in a sense, the ultimate narcissism. I'm sorry, Donald Trump is
No.
in the back of my mind as I'm saying this, but and
You were the only one. It didn't occur to me at all, Tom.
yeah, right.
Yeah, right.
We can't ultimately we can't judge, but the black hole is basically so
Ultimately.
self-contained that there is no awareness of anything else.
Yeah. The cosmic metaphor for the ultimate option against God.
Yeah,
Good. You write that down, Shavira. That's well put.
yeah. But it's not so much an option against God as it is an option
For self.
for self that excludes anything else.
Yes.
So that even
Yes.
God can't get in.
Yeah, exactly. Isn't that
Right.
like the sin against the Holy Spirit, something like that too? That,
Yes, yes.
When you can't, where God just totally closed. That's
Yeah.
the one God can't do anything about.
Yeah.
You want to put
If
it?
if you don't mind, stay with me for a minute and reflect on Bergoglio when he got fired. He was the head of the Jesuits. He got fired and sent to Germany. What eventually became of that? He discovered Mary, the undoer of knots. And when he returned, he was a pastor, not an authority figure. And to me, that whole theme has carried through. And I think that was a conversion moment or a conversion option that he accepted. And it's touched my heart every time I pay attention to it.
The thing that touched my heart right in conjunction with that was, if I remember correctly, the very first interview he had after he became Pope. The interviewer asked him, "Who is Jorge Bergoglio?" And right out of his mouth comes, "I am a sinner."
And as George said, he wasn't being cute about it. He was being very real about it.
Yeah.
Yes.
In Calvinism, they have an acronym, TULIP, TULIP, which really summarizes the 5 points of their religion, of their theology. And one of them is irresistible grace. In other words, if God decides to elect you, you have nothing to say about it, and you can't resist it, and you can be hostile to it, and yet you're going to be among the saved, which I've always found interesting. And
You okay?
there's something else here. There's unconditional election. That's the U of TULIP. When he calls you, man, you're called. And you may not like it. You may want to get out of it. But you don't have the freedom to do that. Your will is overborne. It's interesting. I just, it's very logical in a way.
Mhm.
And
That does go
there's
along
all
with the Hound of
kinds-
Heaven. Goes along
Yes.
with the Hound of Heaven, doesn't it?
Yeah. And down the nights and down the days,
Mhm.
but they have, what was I going to say? They even go so far, the L at TULIP stands for limited atonement. the atonement only was for the benefit of those who are elect. The rest of mankind, Jesus' suffering was not for you, wasn't intended for you, didn't serve you, didn't do you any good. Pretty severe, huh? Pretty stark.
It's too stark for me. I
A good reason not to be a Calvinist.
absolutely.
Very good.
Well, it depends if you made the cut or not.
Yeah, well,
Well, it seems to me that inspired the scene in the play by the French author Jean Anouilh, who gives this scene where people are gathered at the gate of heaven, and all of a sudden, some people are going in whom other people in the crowd don't think should be allowed in. And so the other people in the crowd work themselves up into such a frenzy that it gets to the point where in that instant they themselves are damned.
Well, but it's got nothing to do with, as I understand it, and I had a very good friend who was a minister in this faith. It's got nothing to do with what you do. I mean, if you're chosen, you're chosen, and it's unconditional election. And let me see here.
so the problem.
Do they go so, George? Do they go so far as to give you a number of those who are chosen?
Oh, yeah.
No, like 144,000. No.
And the other thing is, George, how do you know where you are? Because if you knew,
You know that from
Worldly
good works,
success.
from good
What?
works, and worldly success too, but good works. In other words, the foremost Calvinist in our area is John MacArthur at Grace Community Church, and he is when he preaches on the Gospel of James, the Epistle of James, he sounds like a Roman Catholic about good works and all that, to the extent that he's controversial in that faith, because he's subject to creeping Roman Catholicism, his critics say. He hates the Catholic Church, and he said no, and it's just that the good works is the sign. Once you're chosen by God, you want to be good. And naturally, how could it be otherwise, he would say. That's why, for several years, I worked out with this guy 3 days a week, and we would always argue this stuff. And I finally decided that the Catholics and the Calvinists are each coming off cartoon versions of the other. We think of them as cartoon caricatures, and they of us, only they really are. I mean, I used to tell my buddy,
among us guys.
Got that.
Yeah.
you are positing a God who creates people for the fun of sending them to hell. I mean, what other purpose is it if they can't escape it? It's interesting though, because Calvin was no dummy.
Right.
Oh, no.
Well, there's a certain hint of unconditional election. If you take St. Peter, he was chosen, and even those terrible things he did couldn't screw it up.
Yeah.
So there's a hint of that among the baptized. So we don't carry it, we say that free will comes in, et cetera, et cetera. But there is this, when St. Peter calls you a royal nation, a kingly people, there's a certain sense of election to that is more than ordinary.
Yeah. In the scripture, I maintain that the scriptures, at least superficially, are weighted very heavily in favor of a Calvinistic view.
of election.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like one of my favorite passages for prayer is, I guess it's Ezekiel 38. I will put in your real hearts. I will take away your hearts of stones. And you know,
I will set you on the land of your fathers, and I will be your God, and you will be my
will be
people.
my
It's
people.
36, Ezekiel 36. One
Okay.
of my favorite passages.
That's
In
wonderful.
fact, it's the first reading on the liturgy, excuse me for interjecting this, on the liturgy of the hours on Saturday morning.
Yes,
Because
I know that. Yeah.
when I had an open heart surgery, I was told on Friday night that I had to stay and I couldn't go home because I had too many issues that had to be addressed by the surgeon. And that happened on Friday night. And on Saturday morning, I woke up and started to read the morning prayer. And it said, I will give you a new heart.
And you've been a fundamentalist ever since.
And Frank,
It's amazing what you've called out in me, George.
there are no coincidences.
There you
Yes, there
go.
are.
There are no
Anyway.
coincidences.
All right, Bob.
Anyway, but if you read the verses in front of that wonderful passage,
Yep.
God is like really pissed.
Yeah.
And he says, you guys are embarrassing me.
Right.
And I'm going to fix this. I'm going to rewire you. It's not, yeah, it sounds like Calvinist theology, like predestination, or it's at least capable of being read that way. And just so many passages where God is telling people he's going to help them do good, but it's almost invariably for God's glory, not for the benefit of the wretch whom he's saving. You know, I don't know.
Well, another
But,
theme through that is that this idea of election is not for your own good, it's for mission.
yeah,
It's for you becoming the light to the world. And
And
as
to
you're
our
talking about
generation
election, I
and
can't
the
help but,
next two generations.
yeah. I can't help but wonder if many times, I'm not going to say every time, but we hear, that concept of unconditional election, that if we replace that with unconditional love, that there's got to be some kind of room in there for free will. And I wonder if at least the way that we're cartoonishly understanding Calvinists is that they're claiming to know God's mind a little bit too certainly.
oh, yes, they are not nuanced thinkers, particularly. But like I actually heard MacArthur preach on this once because I happened to be at his church for something. It was a baptism, and he goes through Luke 16, the rich man and the poor man, the dogs used to lick the sores of the poor man sitting on the porch of the rich man. Now, I'd always had certain interpretations of that, like the rich man's, his ass is in hell now because he ignored the poor man, Isn't that the way we tend to see it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's a social justice issue. Well, according to MacArthur, it's because he ignored the scriptures. Because when he wants his brother, he wants to go back, talk to his brothers and set them on the right path. And Abraham says, nah, if they didn't listen to the prophets and the scriptures, they're not going to listen to you. They're not going to listen to Moses or anybody else. And the parable in his mind was primarily about the supremacy of the scriptures. Well, that's kind of the
Ah,
way a
geez.
Catholic sees it.
Nope.
Well,
Hey,
I think,
brothers,
I think
I've
there's
gotta
something to
take
be
off.
said for that because the scriptures pull us out of ourselves.
Yeah.
To my mind, his hell was created by the fact that even even in his own hell, he was seeing Lazarus just in terms of what Lazarus could do for him.
Right.
Father Abraham, send Lazarus to, you know, dip
Yeah.
the tip of his finger in water and send Lazarus to my brothers and all of that. And so it's quite obvious that that gulf, to me at least, the way I preached on it, for whatever it's worth, that gulf that exists between the realm of Abraham's bosom and the rich man was created by, again, his own self-centeredness. In other words, he had sort of created a black hole that
Yeah.
nothing other than self-interest gets out of that, or gets out of that black hole.
I agree.
Yeah. Ned has.
MacArthur, I mean, it seems to me that there's a certain sense in which either message, the scriptural passage, admits of the possibility of either message. It's what your theology is that tells you which one you're going to emphasize.
Mhm.
I mean, there is something of what MacArthur is saying.
There is.
Also.
And I was just shocked when I heard him say that. Yeah, my initial reaction was to start throwing tomatoes at the pulpit and laughing. And then, like in half a minute, I said, "But wait, it clearly bears that interpretation."
I like what you said, Frank, the way you said about how the scriptures offer either way, and it's more the theology that then kind of determines it. And I'm just thinking about the conversation that we're having since I was able to log on. It's so different from, I mean, our sense is that God, like you say, Bob, that maybe he's not a giggling Buddha, but that God is for us, that God's desire is for our joy and well, that's what it says in the gospel this Sunday. It is this coming Sunday. It pleased the Father to give you the kingdom. I mean, that's what God wants for us, and it's so different from the way the Catholicism that I was raised up in the beginning, that the old fear business and whatever else. And that was that God is waiting to undo you. I mean, he's just waiting for you to make one false misstep, like you say, George, so that God can then send you into the fiery furnace,
Yeah.
And that's kind of what I fear about some of these. Our Bishop Basha one time was giving a confirmation homily in our parish, and there was a priest was there from the San Francisco Archdiocese. I forget his name now, but he had a nephew who was being confirmed, whatever it was. We were sitting next to each other as Basha was talking, and he's going through the gifts of the Holy Spirit, and he says, and then the fear of the Lord, he says, should we be afraid of God? And of course, the little kids say, no. He says, yes, we should. He says, we should be quaking in our boots. We should be quaking in our boots in the face of this awesome God. And this priest turned to me and he says, well, I think we've just made a whole lot of non-believers with that one sentence. But that's the man's mentality. I mean, you would not believe the homily that he gave at the chrism. I'm just saying, this man is a Jansenist of the first order, and I don't think he's alone. I think
no.
That's why we are so reactive about these reactionary bishops in this whole segment of the church. It seems they just finished their little soiree at the Meritage Hotel in Napa.
At the Napa Institute, yes.
Napa Institute with, Bill Barr and all that. I mean, it's nothing more than a political organization of people who are fighting culture and everything else. But I think down deep inside, they have this deep fear. At least that's my what do you say, Tom, in my humble opinion? I would add,
Right.
in my humble but infallible opinion.
In all modesty, of course.
Yeah, right. Not to, but anyway, I just think that it's interesting. Aren't we lucky to be living, to have been serving now in an era when we've moved in this other direction where, you know, we're at least our theology has recovered that aspect of God, you know.
And from our side, Gary, that idea of conversion that I think it was Phil Berryman put it out recently, but this was from Lonergan: conversion intellectual, conversion moral, conversion religious. And then the challenge, does psychic belong in there or not? But I think each one of us has had some point in our life of intellectual conversion, moral conversion, and religious. And that's why we can speak to the next generation, I think, about that factor. I hope that's a topic worthy of some more discussion.
I'm still,
You know, I wonder how Archbishop Naumann of Kansas City feels after that election in Kansas about abortion on Tuesday. I mean, if ever the bishops who favor, you know, us getting into throwing elbows under the basket in these plebiscites on abortion that are going to be held all over now, and think, you know, I mean, I would have thought the Kansas election would have been a piece of cake for the pro-life movement, wouldn't y'all?
And it was not the case.
And it was not.
Not at all.
58%.
Yeah,
It was
very
significant.
lopsided. And that's a conservative state. I mean, that's not a Trump resentment conservative state of recent vintage, you know. I mean, Kansas has been a conservative state going back to the 30s or the 40s. And look what it did. I mean, I was just shocked. And what's that say to the Right to Life League and the politics of the situation?
Help me understand, George. Do you see a connection with this conversion idea? Are people ready for conversion or that topic?
Oh, I have no idea. But I think that's the only way to go. You know, it's not to try to become the church of forced childbirth by law. Is to become the church of compassion and service and kindness.
That's where my heart is, for sure.
What else is going to work?
Yeah.
Does
Tom?
the Holy Spirit work outside of our Catholic understanding? Of course.
Of course.
Is there, you know, you're asking. I don't
Wait,
know.
Bob, and I say that even without George Farrick here watching.
I like your question a lot, because it suggests to me, is, you know, the question is there a hint of God's Spirit working in this action, which, you know, the bishop who was doing the confirmation, of course, would be totally in shock and scandalized. But might the Holy Spirit be working here behind the scenes quietly, that people are saying something? And in my mind, I'm making a connection back to the conversation we had about and ongoing about Joe Foot, Fuchs. And in the time since we met, particularly for Frank, do you remember Joe Fuchs disappearing for a few years at the Greg? And looking over some notes and stuff, mostly coming from thank you from some of you out there doing some loving research. He did disappear. The context for this was that I spoke of his coming back after spending part of his summer in a literally listening to the stories of women and perhaps their husbands talking about why they were pursuing abortions. And that context. And he came back into class and he just raised some questions. What touched me at the time was, oh my God, he's really sharing with us kind of like his humanity, that maybe we need to rethink morality. And I'm looking here sort of in my notes, and this was the reference to Fuchs in the America article in April of 2005 by James Keenan, another Jesuit who was one of his doctoral students over the years.
He's at BC, Jim Keenan is, yeah.
Yeah. And basically the image that occurred to me was this was Fuchs' conversion. And in Keenan's own words, he says he went from a theology of obey and follow to becoming an adult in the sense of looking at church teachings and their impact on personal lives. In other words, in the formation of a mature moral conscience. And we know what that led to after that. He had been named to the Birth Control Commission in the hopes that he would turn it down. And he became not only the advocate, but the major writer of the approval of it. And then he basically said, when Paul VI thumbs down it, he basically said, I cannot in good conscience uphold the church's position. I can't return to class. And he disappeared for a couple of years from Greg. And then not only that, but that was very impressive. He repudiated a number of the books that he had written, and he asked the Gregorian press to remove some of these books, to stop printing them, stop promoting them. And that was essentially
Classic
imagine
conversion. Wow.
Just imagine what he must have gone through.
We've been kind of alluding to various types of conversion. Well, this for me was a conversion that was very, very touching, because it did touch my life at the time. And it's interesting how many years later, there are repercussions of it, and coming across some of the readings and then the answering, oh, so that's what happened to him, which I didn't know. Thank you for those references, particularly to Keenan in that article in America. If you want to take a peek at it, it's in our notes out there that someone had sent them.
I have to say, I'm uncomfortable with all the discussion that we've had on abortion, because I have trouble getting past some of the wisdom that's in the church's position about life. And also don't see us at the point where the majority of priests would think that there is a possibility of a pastoral decision when faced with an individual case that's at variance with the church's position on life. And so I have great difficulty sorting out the intersection of the legal requirement, the church's value, and the individual situation that an individual woman may find herself in. And sorting all out. I'm somewhat fortunate, maybe cowardly, that I live in a state where I'm not going to have to vote on it. I was thinking of you Californians and saying, well, how would I vote?
Well, that's,
So
yeah.
the easiest way out is to go and vote no. But given what I just said, I don't know if I could do that.
See, that's the deal.
Or to vote yes and say, well, my vote doesn't count because it's gonna win anyway. I mean, the other position's gonna win. That it's California after all. Same thing as it would be here in Massachusetts. In fact, I don't know why they're having one in California, to tell you the truth.
Well,
But
it's
at
because-
any rate,
Lawyer.
I still have, I'm not comfortable. I mean, I think that the discussions we've had have been an enormous benefit. But I'm still not sure where I come down.
There's Frank, I can echo what the struggle, because I share that same perspective with you. On the one hand, I can look at the science of it and the data that I had shared in my initial visit with you guys and getting to know you somewhat, coming across those statistics, again, reflecting my experience from Professor Halen, moral theologian at Louvain, in this class, issues related to sexuality and morality. Around 50% of the zygotes of fertilized egg do not implant in the first 12 weeks of gestation. The modern number has shot up to somewhere closer to 70%, because there's no way of knowing what happens, particularly except that they have doing chromosomal studies in sort of samples that suggest maybe as high as 70% in the first weeks. How do we reconcile that with the potential, as Professor Halen said, at throwing out the question? Can you imagine a heaven peopled mostly with zygotes? There was no laughter. We can smile, but it was like, huh? And on the other hand, I'm a very traditional Roman Catholic, generations French Canadian in my roots and everything else, and Mother Church teaches. And I remember in moral theology, coming across the notion of tutiorism.
Mm-hmm.
If there's a serious doubt, you need to opt for the safer path.
Right.
And
Father Zalba.
That's Zalba. Voila. And I'm there. So when I say Frank, boy, do I know, in a sense, I can understand the issue that you raise and surface, the level of discomfort. It may not sound that way, but boy, do I share that with you the same way. And I don't know how I am going to vote on that. I'm very glad that I have what we used to call a spiritual director, a soul journeyer, a soul friend, who's a Benedictine, the abbot at a local monastery where I'm involved, and who's also a licensed clinical psychologist, that I can bounce some of these thoughts and ideas on. And I know what he's going to say in the best Benedictine tradition, but I'm going to raise it anyway. How to heaven do we vote? You have to vote our conscience on this because it's going to be on the ballot, and I don't know how I'm going to vote.
I'd like to put the ball back in Gary Lombardi's court, and that is reading the product of the Napa Institute, which comes down solidly in favor of every fertilized ovum has full human qualities and rights. which I totally deny. But how do we dialogue with these people? I mean, can we love them as fellow Catholics? You're in the middle of that, aren't you, Gary?
Well, no, I no, I don't. Yeah, Basha and I just don't agree at all about many things. I mean, ecclesiologically,
Mhm.
I have no when you in a pastoral setting, and I've had Frank, I mean Tom, we've had these things a number of times where we had to help people who are in a situation where they're considering an abortion. I've never ever, I cannot in my own conscience ever say to them that it would be okay if you had one. I can't do that because I do believe ultimately whatever zygote got there, this one's on the way. This one is becoming a human being at some stage. So I don't have any, and I also know, especially from, I've had a few times, a number of confessions of people who've had abortions and who are going through the tortures of hell, not because it was the law of the church, but because it was so contrary to their whole maternal instinct, I guess, or whatever. So, and they're suffering, and that's what that Rachel's Vineyard, it's a ministry to people. So there's obviously something really wrong with that. I don't have any problem with that. My question is about, is it wise to make it illegal? I mean, given the fact, as I said this the last time, that the way these laws are written, there are procedures that the church would approve.
Yeah.
But that if the law is not written properly, the doctors would be prohibited from helping to save the mother's life. I mean, so I don't know that it's wise to make it illegal. And Tom, that's the thing we're going to have to choose. I had dinner with my friends and my priest friend from Sonoma, Jim Fredericks, who's a theologian, Randy Calvo, the retired bishop of Reno, and Bill Justice, who's the retired auxiliary of San Francisco, and one of them. And they're in touch with the bishops of our state here, and the bishops are going to make this an issue for Catholics to vote on. I mean, they're going to get involved in, they've done this before, get involved in this particular referendum. And I don't know how it's going to be worded, but I mean, what if it's worded in such a way that you could have an abortion up until 3 weeks before birth or whatever?
Oh, it is.
That's what it is, yeah.
I mean, I couldn't vote for that.
Right.
But I just don't know the wisdom of making it illegal. That's what I don't know.
Yeah, Bob, when you're talking about the Tutsi or Pars, what would be safer, given these two starkly different decisions? If you vote no on this, are you giving the benefit of the doubt that this is a living person to the fetus? Is that where the benefit of the doubt should go? Well, I guess as Catholics, in theory, at least, we don't have a doubt. But in terms of making social policy, should the benefit of the doubt go to the fetus? Okay, we can't really convince everybody that you're a person, but maybe we can help convince people not to slay you in utero. Should that little being get the benefit of that doubt? Or, should the benefit of the doubt go with the living, breathing mother who, for whatever reason, doesn't want this fetus to see the light of day? It's a benefit of the doubt is, to me, I would give the benefit of the doubt to the fetus, I believe. But
You sound like an attorney. You raise the question and you answer.
He is.
Oh, imagine that. And I thought Frank was gonna, you had addressed it to me, George. And I see Frank's hand is up
Yeah.
and he's gonna rescue me. Watch.
Well, no, I just, first of all, the Tutsi or Paz, as I understood it, is always the church's position. That's the safer part, to take the position of the church. That's what the casuists thought, okay? So, Bob, I have a little trouble. I think to some extent, it's something of a caricature to say that 70% of zygotes are not in heaven, or might be in heaven or whatever. And therefore, the logic for making a decision over which we have control is driven by the incidence of decisions over which we have no control. So I have somewhat that I don't find that as convincing. I do recognize that it's something worth pondering, but I'm not sure I find it as convincing because of that jump that's being made. And on the other hand, I find the Tutsi or Paz deadening because it's a recipe for not taking pastoral risk. And good pastoral practice includes risk.
Good point.
And so you got, all these, streams going, very strongly in all sorts of different directions. That's all, point I wanted to make.
Yeah. The conversation, I remember at one point, I raised the language used by some of the fathers and then later by Augustine and later by Thomas Aquinas of talking about ensoulment.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important notion, an important concept, in that sense. When does this chunk of protoplasm, even if there is a primitive heartbeat and blood flow, and if one could, some brain, when does God's Spirit act on it and ensoulment takes place? And I'm so bold as to suggest, I think we get some clues from some of the other religious traditions, in addition to our own, the early fathers saying somewhere around the end of the first trimester, somewhere around the magic, that number around 12 weeks or so, when you can begin to detect a heartbeat. I mean, a lot earlier these days, but for sure, given the state of medicine in the past, and in the sense how in the Jewish tradition, not the high Jewish or strict Orthodox, which is closer to Christianity in a lot of ways, believing it happens much earlier, but lots of traditional Judaism says not until that baby emerges down the birth canal do we talk about it as a human being. Well, Frank, that's a little late.
Or even the first breath.
Yeah, I mean, I think we ought to ask mothers what they feel when they feel the first kick.
Yeah.
It's rather interesting. The news today in Los Angeles, there was at the corner of La Brea and Slauson yesterday a horrific accident in which I think 6 or 7 people were killed in a fiery collision. And I read it on several news sources that 2 of the victims, and they count them as 2 victims, were a mother and her unborn baby. Now, I find it very interesting. I don't know what stage of pregnancy she was in, but I find it very, very interesting that in this media atmosphere where there is, I think, a concerted effort to dehumanize the unborn baby, by consistently calling it a fetus, which is a scientific term, valid, but nonetheless, common sense sees it as an unborn baby. And, these reporters, they basically say among they counted both the woman and her unborn baby as victims of death there. And so, our terminology is often going to be, I don't know, ambiguous perhaps.
Value laden.
And sometimes a lot depends. Do you call it a fetus if you don't want it, or an unborn baby if you do want it?
In an insurance suit, as a result of that accident, would the family of the mother and the unborn child be able, according to California law, sue for the death of two persons? George?
Yes, I believe so.
Mm-hmm.
The variable being that the mom wanted this child.
Yeah.
Had she not and aborted it, well,
Yeah.
fetal
So
tissue.
basically, we determine whether it's human or not by whether it is wanted or not.
Yeah,
I mean, that's actually in California law, George, right?
yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Mhm.
At least in case law, isn't it? I don't know if it's
Yeah, no, I think
codified
it's
in the
even in
book.
the stat. I'll research that for next week because it's an interesting question.
Mhm.
Ned's brought that up in the past.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to
Um,
sneak out of here, so thank you. Another fascinating.
You're a blessing. Thank you, Gary.
well,
Yes, thank you,
guys.
Gary.
We're,
Bye, Gary.
we're getting close to wrap up time, I think, Tom, anyway, right?
Yeah.
We are, yeah. So should we allow ourselves to be imperfectly finished now and see where George's research takes us, and where whatever we're thinking of over this next week takes us? I couldn't help but think that one of the things we're struggling with is what somebody articulated, which we, in a different context, we are searching for the perfect black and white answers. And the perfect is the enemy of the good.
Yeah, except our religion or our tradition tells us there is a black and white answer.
Our religion,
Frank, yeah.
there are a lot of
Catholic-
degrees as to how you hold
Right.
different doctrinal statements.
Right, they're both and, nature and grace, that's the fundamental. So
Yeah.
both and, we're back and forth a lot.
And
Yeah.
whenever we have a both and, we have to look at the relationship between those two terms. We can't just say this and this. We have to say,
Yeah.
how does this relate?
And I suspect that ego is at the heart of the either or. The call to be ego right as opposed to pastoral.
Well, for us sinners, that's true, but that's not the ideal for the church.
Say more.
Well, I mean, I think the church says there's a body of thinking that will give you some guidance as to how this might be weighted one way or the other. Not necessarily decided one way or another, because conscience is a critical element, but how it's weighted one way or another.
Good. I like that point.
There's an interesting quote from this biography of Archbishop Jadot that I think I sent you in the past. I'm going to send it again, recording an informal reaction of Paul VI to Humane Vitae that Jadot mentioned to this author. And we don't often consider, because Paul VI was such a guarded, private person, unlike Bergoglio, that we don't often consider that. Okay, where was the ambiguity in his own mind subsequently about Humane Vitae?
Right.
But I'll find that and send it to you because I think it is a very interesting, tiny little insight.
I think he was perhaps driven by the Tutsi or Paz.
May have been.
As you defined it, yeah.
I think he
There's another little insight that I remember reading. I could never probably find it, but somewhere or other, Ratzinger said he agreed with Paul VI's conclusion, but did not agree with his premises.
Oh,
Fascinating.
That he would arrived at the same conclusion in a different way, but I never saw anything where he further explained that. But
where was he when? Oh, he was a Peritus from the council headed back to Bavaria when Humanae Vitae was published.
yeah, but I think this was long since then.
He was a professor
Yeah.
in
It
Germany.
may even have been probably not a statement as Pope because I don't think he would have been that unguarded, but
I think
definitely
he was excuse me, Tom, he was probably at Tübingen with his buddy Hans Kung.
yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. I suspect it was something that comes from the time he was in the Doctrine of the Faith.
and they went for a swim together.
Right.
but no mass at that swim, right?
That-
And
On
they
that-
came out at different ends of the
Kung
pond.
was quite the swimmer.
You know, Herbert, I wish Fred were here, but Herbert told me that Herbert was very close to Cardinal Sunes. And Cardinal Sunes was very close to Paul VI. And Herbert was in London doing ecumenical stuff with the Anglicans when the encyclical was issued. And was summoned back to Rome for various reasons, but stopped in Brussels to see Sunes, and Sunes told him that Paul's draft was de fide, and that Sunes talked him out of it by falling weeping to his knees and
Wow.
saying, "Please don't do this. This will be a blunder of historic proportions," which it is anyway. But can you imagine? And it worked. I mean, Paul had that much regard for Sunes.
Yeah,
So-
well, similarly, they say Ratzinger dissuaded John Paul II from declaring Mary as, what was it?
Mediatrix
of all
of
graces.
all-
Co-mediatrix.
Can you imagine?
Co-redemptrix, yeah.
Co-redemptrix, I'm sorry. Can you imagine what that would do to ecumenical relations? I mean, we're still getting over the assumption, it's just crazy.
Not to mention infallibility.
Yeah, not to mention.
So there is a Methodist church on Cape Cod that has 4 or 5 windows dedicated to the Blessed Mother.
Really?
Yeah,
Yes,
I'm told. A friend of mine has been there, so he
Right.
told.
Right. I was blown away in my work ecumenically with pastors, discovering the number of Baptist pastors who had a personal devotion to Mary, and it was like, huh, really?
Well, there's
Also
a
the Muslim.
song that's sweeping or has swept through a lot of these churches, and the refrain or something like, "Mary, did you know?" Do you
Mhm.
know that song?
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
and that
in the-
Protestants have no trouble singing that.
Right,
apparently.
and that's in the Black church tradition, particularly that hymn, "Mary, did you know?"
Uh,
Yeah. Well, all over the place.
All over the place.
Once again,
So shall we,
great 2 hours.
looking forward to next week?
Yep. Thank you all.
And God bless you
God bless.
all. And I am going to push the little magic red button right now.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Have a-